Welcome to White Women Wake Up. I'm Karen.
And I'm Jonelle, and we're here to explore how we challenge cultural norms, unpack our privilege, and foster empathy through raw, intergenerational conversations. So let's wake up together.
Yay!
Woo! Okay, before I get into our homework, Karen.
I know, I'm sorry.
We have a couple fun little announcements to make to everyone, listener audiences. So we're starting also a YouTube channel. So if you're interested in watching us as a podcast, we've had a couple people ask about it, like, hey, are you in YouTube? So we thought we'd give it a try. So we're filming us too, so you can kind of see like our facial reactions and responses to everyone. So yeah, check out our YouTube channel. We will have it linked below. And then the other fun thing is we have merchandise on our website. If you're looking at the video, you can see it right now.
I didn't wear mine. I'm sorry.
You can wear yours another time. So right now I'm wearing a sweatshirt that says Wake Up. And it's interesting. We thought about this. It felt a little commercial at first, like, why are we doing this? But what we realized is the merchandise continues to help us spark conversation. So, like, even for example, I wore this in Trader Joe's the other day, and someone did ask me, like, oh my gosh, I love your sweatshirt. Like, what does it stand for? And so I was able to have this conversation and open up about all of the things that we're trying to do here, like a shame-free space for conversation, for learning and growing. And so it just was kind of like really fun and exciting to have this. So anyways, we kind of keep hoping we can keep moving the conversation in different ways. But those are two fun announcements.
I love it. Okay, Jonelle.
And then homework.
Me, Miss Homework Queen.
I know.
Okay, so we were supposed to look at when we compare. That was kind of our discussion last week. And so it was interesting because I don't think you were trying to diss Jamie Lee Curtis.
No,
what you were trying to do is just that sparked this conversation on comparison. Okay, go for it. Did you think about it? Did you know what? It's not homework. You're not getting graded. Yeah, so it's really just
feeling the
about
pressure.
Something. Yeah.
It was a good thing to think about. And so what I've learned is comparisons aren't necessarily my big issue in life, but I did kind of think about, like, where am I not allowing space for someone to, like, give their story? And something I tend to do a lot is, are you okay with your mic there?
Sorry.
Playing around with it. Something that I tend to do a lot is jump in. My mind thinks rapid. Think Gilmore Girls. I'm sure even listening to this podcast, you guys can understand. We're even slowing down our normal rate of conversation. The two of us talk incredibly fast on a regular basis. And so my mind tends to jump like 3 to 4 steps ahead. And so oftentimes that leads me to interrupting people and interrupting conversations. And so I don't necessarily compare. I shut down people through interruption. And so that's something that I'm aware of, trying to work on. Am I doing great at it? No, not really. But at least I'm aware and I'm trying. So that's kind of what made me think of this week. What about you? Did you have anything you thought about?
Well, I just think, I did. And, obviously this is something I've been working on for a while. So, it's not anything new because I've had a tendency to compare. And as a teacher, I do use comparisons a lot in my lecture slides and things like that because, you might be comparing genres or so forth. But I think the problem is in our day-to-day conversations with each other, what we're trying not to do is shut people down. We're trying to let people share their stories in a way that's healthy and continuous and unique and authentic. And so when I jump in and I interrupt and I try to compare, that becomes a dilemma. So, I've had many, and I'm sure I'll keep telling shared stories, but this week it wasn't as much of an issue for me at this point. Okay, Jonelle.
Okay.
So,
it's your turn for a topic.
Your turn. So, we're trying to center the conversations on feminism, gender identity, gender dysphoria, white women, white privilege. So I feel kind of funny using a male example, but I'm going to do it because I think that it helps. Okay. So I was watching the Menendez documentary on Netflix the other day. And I think because you and I have had, or we all, hopefully our community here is having this conversation as well. We've been talking a lot about bias and perception. And so every time those words came up in in that documentary, it just made me think. And so, and you know me, my curiosity is often comes from two disparate spaces, right? This idea of one thing and then it comes to another. So let me, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Menendez case, it was two brothers in the 80s. And they were, funny thing is, they're half Cuban and half white. But in the 80s, they were, because they identified as white, they were considered white privileged males. And they were very, very wealthy. So when they murdered their parents, the Beverly Hills police, I don't know if it was Beverly Hills, it was in that area, never questioned that they would be the murderers. It was because of the perception of who these young men were. They were upstanding citizens. The family was upstanding citizens. It would never even occur to them that a murder would exist within that household. So this is our perception. This is our bias, and it was biased for them, not against them. And yet, as the story unfolds, okay, then the next part of that story is because the perception at that time was the only reason white people would kill, and this is a white perception from a white audience. So I know Black persons that may be listening to this would be like, well, we know a lot of reasons why white people would kill, but that was from a white-centered audience. The minute they started spending a lot of their money, then all of a sudden, there was a motive. And the motive was greed and wealth. Okay? So perception. I'm getting there, trust me. Then it goes deep because these young men really killed their parents because they had been severely sexually abused. And in the 80s and 90s, because we weren't an educated, or at least the white culture was not educated on sexual abuse towards men, no one would believe them. No one believed him. The perception of who these men were, they would believe that they could be liars, but they couldn't believe that they had been sexually abused. Now, fast forward, we watch this story now, and we can see in their reactions in the trial, we know we as a community, and we as a white community in particular, have been responsive to sexual abuse. And we understand, no, I should use the word not responsive. Jonelle's kind of shaking her head. Not responsive, but we've been willing to educate ourselves in the fact that men can be sexually abused and that it is real and it's not false. So what's interesting is as we've moved fast forward, we have now we're able to identify the reactions of these young men. We're able to validate their story. We're able to understand through our own education that they truly were sexually abused and they were raped. I mean, it was horrible.
Horrific.
Absolutely horrible. And I think right now we're more willing to hear their story. Okay, here's my connection. Here's my connection in our conversation. Why are we willing as white people to do our work to understand sexual abuse, how it's happened to men in particular in this case? Because we've come a long way. We have come a long way in at least identifying and acknowledging that their story was real and authentic. And yet we can't even identify a transgender story or someone with race and culture or even our own, biases. So that's my question. That's what I want to talk about today is, clearly our perception of these men have changed. We trust that their story is truthful and we're willing to listen to it. And yet DEI efforts are backing up. There's so many efforts that are reversing in our society. So that's what I want to throw out there, and I want to have some conversations around that.
So, kind of some initial thoughts around this.
Yeah.
First of all, you did push my buttons a little bit because you're right. I didn't want to center any story around men on this podcast because I feel like there's so many things to center, and men
And white men
are not really what I want. But I think you did bring up an interesting issue in the sense that I actually disagree with you. I don't think we are open to hearing men who are sexually abused. And I think this is a particular story because you're not a true crime junkie like most of my generation. I know the Menendez case like inside and out. I was watching documentaries when I was like 10 that would show up on TV for this. And so I think the reason why is my generation has been told this story over and over and over again. And so I think this is why there's a little bit more empathy and understanding to their story in particular. But for men as a whole, I don't think there still is. There's a huge stigma around sexual abuse for men. But here's where I want to twist it.
Because that's not truly my issue here is how have we been able to move the needle forward in that conversation? And yet, like the conversations that we're talking about transgender youth, about feminism, about all these other things, I feel like, yes, we've moved it forward, but really, we've got so much work to do.
I see your loose tie.
Okay. Oh, I love this subject.
No, the subject is different. I see your loose
bias.
I see your loose tie. It's interesting. My friends and I used to go to a trivia program where this is a side note of where the trivia host would ask these long, crazy questions and give all this detail. And then the end, the question would be like, and who was our first president? And you're like, where did that tie? So I love what you're saying here. I do feel a little bit about like, okay, that's a loose tie. But I do think there's an interesting, I'll get back to your tie that you're wanting to try to attach it to. But I do think you brought up an interesting thing around, I don't think there has been progress in identifying men's sexuality.
Isn't this interesting? Because if a male was listening to this who had been abused, they would feel very much unheard.
Yeah. So I think the bigger
Yeah.
story is I don't think we've made progress in a lot of these areas, and so we need to talk about them.
Yeah.
And there's rolling back. But what I think is more interesting is often, and why you brought this up, is perspective shifts. And so often what happens in conversations like this, we talk so much about, female sexual abuse and well, not so much, I shouldn't say that. We don't talk enough about it.
Yeah.
But it is much more common for women to be raped than it is men. And so the focus tends to be on women. But now we're in a time in the world where people don't like hearing, well, all men or men are dangerous or men do this. And so this happened to me last summer where someone started bringing up statistics on male rape. And it was interesting because it was frustrating to me because I feel like it shifts the conversation.
Yeah.
Just to focus away from the point of all of it.
Yeah.
Like that sexual abuse shouldn't happen in any case. Yeah. So why are we kind of comparing who we should focus on more? But then I heard a really interesting point about it. The common factor is not even the victims, it's the perpetrators. And those are mostly men. So if you look at it, so even men who are sexually abused are still mostly abused by men.
Yeah.
And so it just was an interesting thing that has been like brought up in my head of like how so often we were taught, and I don't know if it's media, I don't know what, to like switch the subject to change our focus. So we don't so it dilutes our focus on things. And so I think this is kind of now tying into your point about this is we're diluting our focus, and so we're not making progress. And so, in fact, and then a lot of people are even rolling back things.
Yeah.
And so, like, why was there focus on this case maybe in particular when
we know why, because it was white privilege, because everyone was enamored with their wealth and their power.
Yeah. Well, and it's a story that's been interesting. I think they've actually done a lot of great work when they've been in prison, and so people have appreciated their their story of growth and amends. But it's beside the point. So anyways, but kind of go back to where you're trying to tie
so one of
this
the
in.
things, I'm going to go back to where I think. So one of the things that I feel, and again, it's my connecting the dots, and someone else, I'm sure a therapist would say, no freaking way. But one of the things that I feel that we're willing to have these conversations about sexual abuse more comfortably than we are about white supremacy is because I know you're shaking your head, but I think we still are. Like I in my classes, we will talk about sexual abuse, and maybe it is about rape and things like that. I'm not just trying that. We will have conversations around it without this kind of layering. And I was wondering if it's because in a way we can all either relate or we can have a kind of a personal space to those kind of places of abuse differently than I am not a Black person. And so because I'm not Black or I'm not Latino, I don't have to be in the conversation. And so this is kind of my connection, like because I have witnessed sexual abuse, or I've seen this, or it's part of a topic that is generationally part of even white culture, Black culture, all different cultures. Are we more willing to have that conversation than we are about racial bias or bias against transgender? Because I do feel like anytime I have not anytime, but often when I have the conversation around these other subjects, white women don't want to talk about them, but they are willing to talk about things like sexual abuse. And maybe it's not them personally, but societal.
I think a lot of people are not going to like my response, but as you started saying that, I think the reason why is because it puts us as white women in the victim state again.
Well, maybe.
And when people don't like being the aggressor, so they don't like to talk about their privilege. They don't like to, again, it goes back to our conversation about being uncomfortable. We are happier and we as the collective, we are, again, not individuals, but like how white women are taught culturally is we are happier in the victim space.
Maybe the word isn't happier. We understand the victim space.
But I don't think we even do we do
in a white way.
In a white way is the thing. And so I do kind of think maybe that's where you're coming.
The thing that I wanted us to talk about is, and it's not, here we just talked all about comparisons and what am I doing. It's not that I'm trying to compare that one is worse than the other. That's not the goal here. Because I think both are horrific, or not both, but I think when someone is sexually abused, it is horrific. It is a horrible act. And being a victim within that space is very true and validating. And yet, a person of color, a person who has been marginalized, has a lot of trauma around what a white person, a white perpetrator may have given them. And yet we're so afraid to have that conversation.
Well, and so it kind of goes back to so there's a bunch of things happening here, I think, in this conversation. I think I still don't necessarily agree that we are comfortable having the conversation. I think it depends on who you talk about, the collective whole. But you're right. In white women, I do think have an easier time talking about, their space with sexual abuse or abortion
or things
stories, and their own stories.
Yeah.
And I agree with that. And they're more comfortable sharing that and having those conversations than talking about race or other marginalized conversations. I completely agree with that. I think society as a whole, though, is not more progressed in those states. And so this kind of goes back to some of the conversations we had about everyone should be a feminist or hood feminism around the state of what's happens is we're diluting our issues. We're diluting our issues by segmenting them when a lot of these really still rape, sexual abuse all happen within these communities kind of thing. And so can we tackle these together, these stories together? We can tackleize and have
it's funny that you should say that. I was going to say the word intersectionality actually really speaks to this because it addresses physical abuse. It addresses whether we've felt marginalized. It addresses our biases and how our biases and perceptions.
Yeah.
In fact, this isn't this topic because that can go on, but CRT was originally coming out of the bias that was happening in the legal system. And so I guess one of the things that I think for me, what was so interesting is how the connection between bias, and in their case, it was favorable, and then it was negative, and how the bias, the bias of the person's hearing the story completely created a specific perception. And as a society, can we work on these kind of conversations to get a little bit, this kind of, to discuss resistance, I guess, to conversations about privilege? Can we have these conversations of where our perceptions and where our narratives have been off simply because of our biases? So anyways, I again, maybe it took us down a different track, but I was putting those two things together, and I was thinking about this language of bias, and I was thinking about this language of bias often creates a perception that is often not real, and it has real consequences.
Yeah. No, I mean, I love it. This is like, even though it was like a
that's kind of how I talk.
Well, this is how you talk. And this is, again, our hope for these conversations is to really kind of show and open up. I know I'm a broken record here, but we're just trying to hopefully get that you guys understand is these are types of conversations that we think happen easily, and these tangents happen easily within the household. And so kind of showing, navigating them and being honest around it and authentic around these things. And so,
Well, I think, too, in summary, one of the things I was interested in is this idea of understanding a little bit more about the subject from a personal landscape and how that subject informs the way that you perceive. And so, and because we don't always share personal landscapes with everybody, or our locations are so different, the intersectionality of things, we're off on I'm using the we, I often am off on my perception. So, just a conversation.
Interesting. Well, that's great homework for next time.
Okay, what is the homework? I can't even synthesize this one.
Maybe learning how to synthesize. No, just kidding. I think the homework next time is, where are we off in our perceptions? So kind of like finding a perspective, like, where did you think something? Where
did our bias and creating a certain perception and that not in a situation being the same?
No,
and
I think that's great.
Big ramifications.
Great homework. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today on White Women Wake Up. Stay curious, stay open, and keep waking up. Have a great one. Bye.
Bye.